But I'm going to start out by saying one of the things that I really love about the members of the Hertz community is that whatever their areas of interest and application, virtually all of us are interested in the really big challenges facing the world today, like climate change and sustainability and food and water supply and public health, just some random examples. And to me, addressing these challenges requires pulling together data and research results from science and engineering and economics, and pulling together the models and analytical tools that can address critical questions. And these are exactly the kinds of challenges that the project Jennie is leading is aiming to help address. And I can say I've been privileged to know and respect Jennie as a colleague and a friend for perhaps longer than I'd really prefer to admit. Let's just say it's been longer, been well before there was even a hint of gray in my hair. You've all had the opportunity to see Jennie's bio, so I won't take our time here to list her extensive experience and accomplishments. But what I do want to say is that while she has lots of expertise in a number of areas, I think her greatest strengths are the ability to drill down and understand the details, while at the same time keeping in mind the big picture of big complex problems. She's an excellent leader of people and project teams, which makes her the absolutely perfect person to be leading the project she's going to present to you today. With that, please welcome Jennie.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it, and have many good memories of the times that we worked together and our continued friendship since that time. So yes, it's my pleasure to talk to you all about my project today. And it is called IM3, the Integrated Multi-Sector Multi-Scale Modeling Project. And I am the principal investigator. I am a senior research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And so I believe my goal here is to talk for about 25 or 30 minutes and then to stop for questions. So that will be my goal. So I thought I'd start with just sort of the nuts and bolts of the project and get these out of the way first, give you all a sense of the scope and the scale of the project. So this is funded by the Department of Energy, Office of Science, the Multi-Sector Dynamics Earth and Environmental System Modeling Program. Bob Valerio is the program manager. And this particular project started in 2016, and we just went through a renewal phase. And the second phase is now approved to start, it has started this fiscal year in 2020. And this is a science focus area within the Office of Science, and these projects are really intended to be decadal projects, but they are also required to go through a triennial renewal process. And so our funding is about $4.5 million a year, and we have roughly about 50 active researchers across 10 institutions. So my institution, PNNL, is the lead institution. You can see here we have other national labs and 6 universities also involved in this work. And it's about 60% of the resources are at PNNL, and about 40% of the resources are going to our collaborators. So I thought I would just start with kind of some of the history of where this project has come from, and just talk about this field of multi-sector dynamics as really an emerging scientific field, and just kind of the general goals of this field. So it's to model how sectors and systems co-evolve, again, in response to environmental, technological, and societal changes, to understand the dynamics, the pathways of change across these interacting components, sectors, scales, and uncertainties. And then also to develop the models and the data and the methods that will allow us to advance the science and be able to inform risk management, resilience, adaptation, and sustainability. There was a workshop in about 2015, which this image over here on the right is the cover from the workshop report. This was sponsored by DOE and the US Global Change Research Program, which some of you may know is the entity that puts out the National Climate Assessment. It's basically formed from all 13 major federal agencies. And so this workshop was convened to understand what some of the needs are in terms of understanding dynamics and resilience in interdependent systems. And I had the privilege of being on the technical working group lead for this task force for this workshop, and it was fascinating. So to date, to my knowledge, and I'm not trying to represent all research in this space, but it's my understanding that the primary funding for this kind of research in the US is coming from DOE Office of Science and also the National Science Foundation. So what I thought I'd start with is actually a result from an analysis that was done as a precursor to IM3. So PNNL actually had a large $20 million internally funded research program that I was part of. And that was really looking at a lot of these same issues. It wasn't called IM3 then. It's called Regional Integrated Modeling and Analysis. But this was, you know, a really interesting project. And one of the really key results from this integrated modeling project was an analysis of water scarcity under a sort of a business as usual future versus a climate mitigation future. So I don't know, I'm not going to assume that everybody knows all these acronyms, but the RCP 4.5 is a mitigation scenario, and the RCP 8.5 is a future that sometimes is called worst case, sometimes it's called business as usual. But these were these two future scenarios that we analyzed, and we coupled a climate model with a socioeconomic model, land use, land cover change models, and water availability model to look at what could happen under these two future scenarios out throughout the rest of the century. And we had a very surprising result. We actually found that the reductions in water stress that you would get from slower rates of climate change under this RCP 4.5 scenario were actually overwhelmed by the increased water stress that came from the mitigation itself. And the mitigation in this case was bioenergy crops. So simply the sheer amount of water that the bioenergy crops required was causing these surface water deficits that were actually worse than what you would get if you didn't control the climate at all. Now, this is not a policy analysis of whether or not to try to mitigate climate change. It's really just showing that there can be unintended consequences. So you really see this if you look in this 2080s panel, which compares the deficit in the future to historical deficits, and the red is showing this larger deficit under the mitigation strategy versus the non-mitigation strategy. So, you know, the caveats are there was this heavy reliance on bioenergy crops. Well, there are multiple ways to mitigate climate change, not just through bioenergy. So this is, again, sort of one of the lessons learned, that a lot of the global modeling is assuming that we're going to plant corn everywhere. And in fact, this did focus on annual rotating crops, not on switchgrass or miscanthus, those kinds of crops. This study only looked at surface water deficits, and it didn't address explicitly institutional constraints or water rights, and it certainly didn't do any formal uncertainty characterization. But it did give a sense of what you could achieve when you start to put together in an internally consistent fashion scenarios of climate, socioeconomics, land use change, and water management strategies. So in IM3, we look back at this paper and we say, we're going to redo this study. And we're going to redo this study with including groundwater as a resource, right? This study didn't look at that. We're going to look at multiple different ways that we might achieve climate mitigation, and really try to understand better what could happen, and also take this at higher resolution, understand water rights, where they are constraining the use of water. So let me move on. So IM3 is specifically targeted at the United States. It is focused on developing and enhancing flexible, open source, and process-based modeling capabilities of both human systems and natural systems, and coupling those capabilities to study the evolution and vulnerability and resilience of these interacting systems. And another specific objective of IM3 is to understand the implications of uncertainty in a formal way. And so this image down here is just a conceptual image of the kinds of sectors that we're looking at and some of the kinds of influences that we are considering in IM3. And what I'd like to do before giving you some of the results that we've had from IM3 is talk through a real world example which illustrates the kind of modeling that we are going after in my project. So I'm going to use the California drought that I guess you could say in 2016, or at least the most severe year in 2016, and look at the multi-sector and the multi-scale impacts that were the cascading effects of this drought, as well as feedbacks. So there were impacts in the energy sector, right? There was a reduction in hydropower generation and an increase in natural gas fired generation. There were land-related impacts. There was crop fallowing, there were related revenue changes, employment losses. Throughout the state, urban areas were required to conserve water. So we had these impacts across these different sectors at the regional scale. But then locally, we had a number of other impacts at sort of the very local scale, such as groundwater table declining dramatically, a rush to drill new groundwater wells, and with significant impacts on energy demands to do that, but also subsidence happening as a result of that drilling, browning of lawns, major changes in land use and land cover from the drought. And then we can look at what happened in Fresno, that that their groundwater table has been declining, but their population has kept growing. So there are all of these interactions and feedbacks, and we could probably spend our entire time adding more arrows and deciding which ones need to be double-headed and which ones don't. But it is this kind of complexity and looking across sectors and across scales and understanding how these different components and systems do influence each other. This is one of the goals of IM3, is to be able to capture these kinds of relationships. So I'm going to give some highlights from our first phase of IM3, and then I will end with where we are going in phase 2, which, as I said at the beginning, we've just initiated that this year, the phase 2. So energy water dynamics was a major focus of modeling in the first phase of IM3. And what we were trying to do was be able to integrate hydrology models with river routing and water management and grid operations, so electricity grid modeling, and to look at this kind of integration again across scales. So we did most of our work in the Western US in this particular thrust area. And here we're showing we did some specific work in the San Juan Basin, which I'll show you some results for in a few minutes, which is of course part of the Colorado River watershed, which plays a major role in the Western electric grid. The capability development here also included modeling actual decisions by farmers, so agent-based modeling, where we're trying to capture the potential that not all these decisions are always made the same way by every entity, but be able to capture some of the diversity in the decision-making. And agent-based modeling is a very interesting area that we are exploring in IM3. And then at the regional scale, looking at integrating the impacts of weather and water into grid operations. And so let me give you some specific examples. So this was a study that was aimed to really demonstrate the impact of using a process-based model versus an empirical model to look at projections of hydropower. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, but process-based modeling is kind of our mantra in IM3, right? If we believe that the future will not be like the past, then an empirically derived model is not going to be very helpful in the future. And so obviously the process-based models are more complex, they have longer run times, they are harder to build, but they do allow, right, because they're process-based, whether it's a human systems model or a biophysical model, that those systems are actually reacting and adapting to new conditions over time. So this particular study looked at taking a large-scale river routing and water management model that actually runs over the whole United States at a 1/8 degree resolution. And it used to have just generic operating rules for its reservoirs. But we went in and did sort of an initial improvement on that hydropower module to account for environmental regulations and operational requirements. And we ran this model for multiple different future climate scenarios, as well as different climate models simulating those climate scenarios. And the real thing to look at here is that the yellow band, the yellow part of this, the yellow box and whisker plot here is the result for the process-based modeling, and the blue comes from a regression-based model. And so what we found was that looking at the future, the process-based model actually shows less uncertainty, less variability than you get from the regression-based model. And at first you might think, that's not what I expected to have happen. You would think that somehow the empirical model would constrain future variability under climate change. But what actually is happening is, because we're using a process-based model, and because reservoir operations influence each other, and there is buffering that can happen through the system, the process-based model actually is able to capture that and actually modulates the effect of climate change when you're using a process-based model versus this empirical approach. Now, here's the San Juan Basin that I mentioned before. Here we did a study looking at two different models that are used in the basin for one for planning, one for operations. And the idea was to understand what is here I'm going to use the term fidelity, which is used differently in different domains, but here models with essentially different resolution with which they represent water rights, infrastructure, intakes, etc. So for this basin, the Bureau of Reclamation, they consider their operations model to be the lower fidelity model and their planning model to be the higher fidelity model. So the planning model is the one that has all of the detailed water rights and a lot of all of the detail in at very high resolution. And these two models were compared for multiple different future climate scenarios. This is a result for the Navajo Reservoir and its storage under the very driest conditions that the Bureau was running. And what you can see here is that the operations model, the lower fidelity model, starts out showing that storage is looking worse under this very, very dry future. But then at about 2075, when the planning model says we've just crossed a threshold here, a tipping point, and the storage is going to zero, the operations model does not capture that. And so this was very, very interesting and surprising in some ways to the stakeholders and the modelers, but it did show the importance of having these high resolution or high fidelity models. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say the higher resolution, more detailed model is always going to be better and that you always have to have it. But we are finding with water and with interactions between water and climate and multisectoral demands for water that, and especially in the West where we have the prior appropriation doctrine and water rights that are prescribed pretty much everywhere, that these institutional restrictions make a huge difference in understanding actually when, where, why, who, and how doesn't get their water. And so having this level of modeling is turning out to be very important to understand what could happen. Shifting gears here to some of our work in the urban sector, we have studied the impact of heat waves, future climate on whether or not cool roofs are being employed as an adaptation strategy. So this was the result of coupling a very high resolution climate model to simulate urban microclimates, taking into account urban canopy, satellite-driven data for the urban canopy, and then comparing current climate in Northern California and Southern California cities with a mid-century climate. And this would have been I believe this was the RCP 8.5 climate. And then to look at whether or not you have cool roofs, what is the impact on the actual exposure to heat waves? So these are person heat waves in thousands. And it's a little bit easier to see the results if you look at the lower panel here, looking at Los Angeles and the surrounding areas, that with cool roofs, we actually end up with exposure that looks a lot like what we have in the current climate. So going ahead 50 years without cool roofs, there's a significant increase in exposure, but with them, we can almost keep things the way they are now as far as exposure. Not to say that now is acceptable, but just that these are very, very effective. This bar chart on the left here is a sort of proxy for what might be happening to energy demands as a function of heat waves and how cool roofs can reduce the cooling degree days, which are again used as a proxy for energy requirements. As we move forward in IM3, we will actually be simulating actual building responses to hourly weather and computing the actual electricity consumption from buildings given specific heat waves, and then actually looking at how that propagates into the electric grid and what is the ability of the grid to meet that demand. Another one of our phase 1 research thrust areas was population. So obviously, if we're trying to understand what's happening at high resolution, we need to have high resolution projections of population and urbanization. But we also want to develop these in the context of what's being modeled globally. And there's a global framework called the SSP, Shared Socioeconomic Pathway framework, that is coupled now with the climate projections. This is all part of the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, global science community approach. So these SSP projections have been developed for the IPCC, and we were able to refine those for the US. So the global modeling is only looking at the US as a whole, and we were able to use more recent data about interstate migration to develop these different projections for population in the US at a 1 kilometer resolution. So this top panel is 2050 population, the bottom is by 2100, and the SSP5 is high population growth in the US, SSP3 is low, and the SSP2 is somewhat in between. But this information is a major driver in our couple modeling workflows. Land use and land cover change. So I mentioned this before, that bioenergy crops are hugely important for, and can be hugely important for achieving climate mitigation. And most of the modeling until recently had not addressed the perennial crops, miscanthus and switchgrass, which use almost no water, right? They are rain-fed. So this has the potential to be a huge game changer for mitigating climate change with bioenergy. So we, as part of our research, we worked on adding these two crops to what's called the community land model. This is a land surface model that simulates all kinds of biophysical metrics over the US and over the entire world. So we developed these two new crops to be included in the CLN model, and then we're able to show the benefits of these perennial crops versus rotating crops in terms of runoff and carbon uptake and other metrics. And land use land cover change is, as I said, very, very important. And the way that we actually work with this is we use a partial general equilibrium model called GCAM, which essentially is modeling the energy economy across the world over time under multiple scenarios. It's a scenario-based model, and it projects land use land cover change at the basin scale. But to really understand things like impacts on crops and crop yields and water scarcity or water availability, we need to have that at a higher resolution. So we have developed a tool called Demeter to downscale those results. And those results get used in these physical models like the CLM model that I just mentioned before. So this gives you a sense of kind of the way our workflow happens when we are driving to these higher resolutions. And this, I know this is a little very busy image here, but we wanted to understand and be able to classify different parts of the US based on the complexity of their multisectoral interactions. And in other words, how complex is Portland, Oregon, say, compared to Bangor, Maine, or to Miami, or to Houston? And we decided to start by looking at the water supply catchments for each city. And we wanted to do that because this is an important, what's called a teleconnection, right? A distal connection to a good or a service that a city might have. And teleconnections, that concept can be used, has been used in other domains, but in the urban space, it's being used to refer to these distal connections to goods and services. So we wanted to understand for different cities, and if we looked at where they actually got their water from, right, which is not necessarily the watershed that the city resides in, how might we be able to classify cities, and then, given that, be able to decide, okay, where do we want to do our research? You know, can we create some cities that are representative and go study those and use those as typologies to hopefully provide some generalizable results for similar cities in that category. So I'm not going to talk through the whole diagram here, but speaking of places like Seattle and Portland, you know, there's the water resource supply source for Seattle and Portland is very well protected. There's very little development in those source watersheds, whereas you look at something like Los Angeles, right, which gets its water from all over California as well as the Colorado River Basin. There is a lot of competition for that water resource. And we can look at, you know, cities all across the US and make some, you know, make some inferences about what the pressures are on their watersheds. And this kind of research is really new. The paper is still in prep. A lot of other sort of vulnerability studies that have been classifying cities related to their water source tend to, and not all, but tend to, again, assume that the city's water supply is coming from its local watershed. And we just know that that is not the case. So this is a way to be able to explicitly capture those teleconnections to the interbasin transfers that are bringing the water, or just the entire watershed that feeds that city. So I want to shift gears now to what we're doing in the second phase of IM3. And we're structuring the project very differently in phase 2. So we've moved from a thrust area organization, which was necessary, I think, for the first phase of IM3. And I should let you know that I worked at the lab before IM3, and I worked on that initial project that I showed you of the water scarcity being worse under the mitigation scenario. But then I came back to the lab a year and a half ago to lead IM3 and to kind of take it from its phase 1 into its phase 2. So in looking at what was happening in phase 1, we were really somewhat siloed. We weren't ourselves being very multisectoral or multi-scale. So the idea for our new design is to actually have much more cross-disciplinary experiments and interactions being studied. So moving away from just sort of energy and water, but now we'll do energy, water, land, and urban interactions in all of our experiments. And we want to be driven by research gaps. So these are the research gaps that we have identified that are driving our research in phase 2. So heat waves and urban vulnerability. There's a lot of gaps here. Understanding population vulnerabilities at the subnational scale, understanding how buildings actually react to heat waves that are running for multiple days, maybe at higher temperatures at night than have ever been experienced before. We're also exploring gaps in research with drought and adaptation to drought. So previous studies have not addressed all of the interactions that surround the conjunctive management of surface water and groundwater in response to drought. And again, human adaptation in general in response to water scarcity. And then again, land use and land cover change, how does that play through this water scarcity picture? And then we will be moving toward looking at the compound effects of heat waves and drought on the electric grid. And so current models in the electricity sector really are unable to simultaneously address short and long-term stressors with the resolution that's needed to really demonstrate that power can be delivered at the time that it's required and with a reasonable cost. There's also very little understanding of how heat waves and drought interact and create these cascading failures through the grid. And then finally, uncertainty characterization. Many of us, well, Dave and Mark, we've all come out of an environment that really was focused primarily on having a single model. And how do you do uncertainty characterization with that model or for that particular decision? But here in this project, we have multiple models connected in a modeling framework, and many of these models might take 6 months on a supercomputer to produce 100-year scenario for the US. And it's doing this at 1/8 degree resolution across the US. So how can we actually characterize the uncertainty when we have a model like that? And how do we attack that challenge? So that's a big part of IM3 moving forward. And so this is my last slide, just to show you our experimental design. So we will be looking at forcings or boundary conditions that are climate scenarios, heat wave scenarios, drought scenarios, population, urbanization, and socioeconomics. And we will be These will be developed to be internally consistent. We'll be looking at ranges of uncertainty in each of these areas, and we will look at how they compound. So it gets a little complicated to show all the combinations on one slide. So you'll just have to take my word for it that that's what we're doing, and that's what this top part of this diagram means. Then we'll be looking at the multi-sector, multi-scale dynamics in these particular sectors. So we'll be looking at how these drivers, these short and long-term stressors, influence the interactions between land use and land cover, infrastructure expansion in the water sector and in the electric sector, urban heat, so urban microclimates, water scarcity, electricity grid stress, and utility financial risk. So how do these all interact with each other? And ultimately, we're really focused on water scarcity and grid stress as sort of our endpoint, vulnerability and resilience metrics. But to get there, we have to look at all of these interacting components. And we're going to do this modeling across multiple scales. So we're going to do this for the whole United States. We will look at it within each of the regional electric grids. We will use higher resolution modeling and look at particular cities and their supporting watersheds, drawing on that classification study that I presented earlier. We will also be modeling up to 6 specific urban areas in the US at a high resolution to look at heat wave and heat wave dynamics and interactions with buildings. And the experimental design includes, cross-scale comparisons. So these really all nest into each other. So we'll be able to compare, for example, what does our Kona scale model say about heat waves in the Denver region? And we'll be studying Denver specifically with a higher resolution climate model and higher resolution changes in building morphology, et cetera. And we'll be able to say something about the value and the benefits of higher resolution modeling or not. We'll be using narrative scenarios, deterministic scenarios to explore uncertainty for these large scale models at the US scale, but then we'll be doing formal sensitivity analysis model diagnostics for the higher resolution modeling for the smaller domains. And of course, there will be increasing spatial, temporal, process resolution as we go from the US scale to the urban scale, The US simulations we'll do a continuous simulation all the way up to 2100 and then be looking at just future time slices for these watershed and urban systems so that we can have again, it's a smaller domain, it's a high resolution model, but we'd really like to be able to run these through a Latin hypercube sampling or Monte Carlo kind of perturbation to really explore uncertainty. So we'll be doing a lot of model development as well as actually hooking up these models and running the experiments. So there's model development that's happening, and as well as the model coupling that's needed to execute these experiments. And as I mentioned, these subdomains are nested within each of the regional grids so that we can again have this consistency in comparing across scales. So that is the end of my talk, and look forward to any questions that you might have or about anything I presented. Or I always say IM3 is sort of the ultimate drinking from the fire hose project, and it's a lot because we are trying to cover a lot of different sectors, a lot of different scales, and it's there's a lot happening, and there are some things that I didn't really have time to talk about today, but I'm happy to if it comes up in questions. So I will turn it over to the moderators to let me know if there are any questions.
If I could beg everybody's forgiveness for perhaps abusing the role as a moderator, I had one question I wanted to toss out at the outset. Jenny, is the goal of IM3 to put together a sort of a complex but coherent integrated set of models and analytical tools, or to do something that's more modular, mix and match, maybe could be used with other things beyond IM3?
Yes, definitely the latter. Definitely not trying to build one model to rule them all. It is intended to be very much a modular framework, and so we are bringing in models. You know, we're not just using models that we've developed in IM3, right? The CLM models developed at NCAR. You know, we are in our subdomain studies. We'll be looking at what's been developed on an open source basis within that subdomain and bringing that into the under the IM3 umbrella. But essentially, yes, we're trying to right size our modeling for the questions at hand. And because it's open source, everything that we're doing, you know, once we release it in the open source repository, is going to be available for other researchers or the private sector or anybody to pick up. And I do want to mention something that I forgot to mention initially, is that the Office of Science likes to think of its research as stakeholder informed as opposed to stakeholder driven. So we are not building models to solve particular stakeholder questions, right? But the idea is that there's an awareness of what those issues are. This is a foundational science, basic science project, but the idea is that these foundational tools that we're building would then be picked up and leveraged and further extended in an applied science capacity or potentially in the private sector.
Jenny, we have a question from the chat from Peter Kramer. And he's asking about your Navajo reservoir plot. He's wondering if the erratic fluctuations in those predictive models are climate cycles or stochastic effects. And if they are due to stochastic fluctuations, is it necessarily wrong for a different model to miss that sort of feedback?
I believe that the fluctuations there are driven by the climate modeling results. No superimposed stochastic modeling that we did. And you know, I wouldn't say it's wrong that the lower fidelity model did not pick up that change in the reservoir storage. I think it's just as I said, I think it's just indicative of the resolution that can be important to have representing these institutional constraints and water demands based on water rights, and that there are many things that we can miss if we don't go to that resolution. We're actually doing some other work in the Upper Colorado using the state model, which is an open source model that the Colorado Water Resources Control Board has developed. And that's a highly detailed model that shows along every river reach, you know, where the demands are, where the water is withdrawn from, what the water right is, and it can ingest hydrologic variability. And you can actually run that model to determine, you know, again, the different reasons that different water users experience a shortage and why. And it's really fascinating. Modeling at one level, coarser aggregation, you miss a lot of these dynamics.
Mike McCracken, you raised your hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Okay. Hi, Jenny. I actually have a comment and then sort of a question. So the comment is, I really think we're making a mistake in labeling these water shortages as drought. To me, the word drought implies sort of a random sort of occurrence, or maybe there's some natural cycle in it, but sort of a random occurrence. Whereas what the GCM climate models basically show pretty robustly is that as you warm, the subtropics expand. And so what's going to be happening is less and less likelihood of rainy years. And you're basically going to have a trend toward aridification. And I mention this because how you respond if it's a drought versus how you respond if you're going into longer term aridification is different. If it's a drought, you might build your reservoir bigger, or you might do something that's sort of temporary. If it's going to be long-term aridification, you might build desalination plants or something. And I really think there's a problem with just using the word drought for explaining what's likely to happen. I was kind of surprised in your pre-IM3 case study you did at Battelle. It did not look like it dried out the southwestern sort of United States and that area, because virtually all the models, I think, show that kind of thing. So that's sort of my comment. The question I have, and it's a question I've had since being involved in the assessments and the social science stuff quite a while ago, is there any effort to go back and try and see if these representations of things like population growth and movement of people, I think we use the same kind of database. We didn't get the model, but we use the same kind of database. To go back and see if they actually work over some period of the past in the 20th century, over several decades? Or are we going to just have all these models based on, well, I think I've got all the processes right, and then not run them over some long time? The climate models have to run from 1850 all the way up to the present. But what about these other models? Do you run them from the past up to the present through some period of time for vegetation and groundwater and all these other things?
Right. Yeah. You just put your finger on one of my major objectives, and something that human systems models typically are not evaluated over a historical period in the same way that the biophysical models are. And there's been, the claim is always that, oh, it's too difficult, the data isn't there, we have these black swan type events that occur that you could never expect an economic model to be able to pick up. But it's not a really very good excuse, I don't think. And so one of the major objectives of our uncertainty characterization thrust in IM3 is to force all the models that we're using in our experiments to be evaluated over a historical period. So you can't just start in the base year and calibrate to it and move forward and assume everything is good. But that is the way most of these integrated assessment models are set to run, and the way, many human system models are set up that way. So we will be doing that, and I think it's challenging, but I completely agree that that's critical to do.
So back a little while ago, Mark Cronshaw, you posted a question on chat that's sort of a broad modeling question. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, thank you. It is a broad question, and based on your extensive experience with modeling, Jennie. So could you make comments about the pluses and minuses of small, fast computation models versus big, slow ones?
I think that my view is that you want to choose the model that's best suited and best sized for the question that you're trying to answer. And I also believe strongly in the value of using sensitivity analysis processes to determine whether you need to add additional detail to your model and take it from being a fast, small model to a larger, slower model. So we are, for example, with the agent-based modeling, we are trying to determine, how important is it to, say, represent all the different water users in a basin, and at what level of resolution to do that. Similarly, if we're looking at how a city evolves over time, what do we actually gain by trying to simulate with an agent-based model how real estate transactions are made and how a city will either densify or sprawl, or could we just, could we use a different kind of a model to do that? So I guess my general feeling is that the fast and small models give you a lot of flexibility, right, to do uncertainty characterization, and I think it's hard to make too many generalizations, right, without having some specific examples, because I really think the science question you're trying to answer, at least in my world, what is the science question you're trying to answer? Then we think about what models would be best suited to do that. Yeah.
So Robbie, I saw you put your hand up, or your virtual hand up, as our fearless leader. Do you want to?
Oh, thank you. No, I was just applauding actually at the end of her session. I'm just finding this absolutely fascinating and very important. But having moved to California from a water-rich area back in the Northeast in southwestern Pennsylvania, it's always I guess I'm finding this whole notion of water usage, responsibility, and planning both fascinating and an issue that I'm trying to get caught up on personally. So thank you all for both the presentation and the questions.
Welcome.
I think the other message in the chat, or question in the chat, is from Matthew Berend, and I'm apologizing if I'm not quite getting your name pronounced right. I'm out of practice, but do you want to unmute and ask it in your own words, because it leads in directions many of us are interested in?
Sure. Thank you, Jenny. This is a truly amazing presentation. Obviously, it's really high impact work. So I was just hoping you would comment a little bit on what you think the impacts are and the channels you have for that.
Yeah, we hope it is high impact. We're currently seeing that our work is being increasingly recognized in the electricity sector and in the WEC, which is the Western Regional Grid. I don't know if you or others work in the electric utility industry, and Dave's going to laugh when I say that the models haven't improved that much since we started working together. I mean, I really have been just amazed. But what's missing is that these planning models tend to assume that hydropower is a fixed input, and all of the analytics are spent on optimizing how the thermoelectric generators will operate and trade, right, with other balancing areas across the whole Western grid. But we know that hydropower is not always going to be at its average value for the future, and so we've been doing a lot of research to show how looking at that variability actually has big impacts on the amount of generation from different sectors of the Western grid, and have different areas of the grid have to pick up when the Pacific Northwest doesn't have as much hydropower, or Northern California doesn't have as much hydropower, and demonstrating that, okay, if we are in a low water year and all this additional generation needs to come from the desert Southwest or from the basin states to make up for this lack of hydropower, well, what if we also have a drought? What if we also have a heat wave? And maybe some of those thermoelectric generators were going to might be constrained because of drought, or potentially because they're down for maintenance. And then there could potentially be rolling blackouts or potential issues with meeting demand. And we have seen some of that, right, in California this last year, where heat waves have caused the California ISO to basically freak out that they're not going to be able to meet demand. And it's because they're not planning together. They're not considering these interactions across the different parts of the Western grid. So we have So to get more directly to your question, a lot of us who work on IM3 in this sort of basic science, you might call it bubble, also work in the applied science arena and work directly for stakeholders like the Cal ISO and the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. So we do feel like they're starting to see the benefits of this kind of modeling and the importance of it, especially as we start seeing more and more of these extreme events. The urban microclimate work that we've done is already being picked up by urban planners and is receiving a lot of attention. And so we publish our channels for getting the word out, our publishing, conferences, AGU. The multi-sector dynamics community is going to have a really big presence at the AGU meeting this December. And of course, we speak at and get invited to lots of different workshops and conferences and try to spread the word that way. So I don't know if you have other suggestions for us, I would love to hear them. And in fact, I would like to just say, I really hope that this talk and this conversation, this discussion, that those of you who are interested and would like to remain engaged with IM3, I would like to remain engaged with you. And if you have ideas for collaboration or just other kinds of problems we might be considering, I would really like to hear about that and really welcome that. So Matthew, did I answer your question? Sort of. All right.
Mark, see your hand.
So thank you. I know I already had my moment, but I wanted to comment on something that Mike McCracken said about seeing if models did a good job of replicating the past. Early in my career, I worked in a reservoir simulation group in the oil and gas industry. And what we did was to simulate the flow in the subsurface of an oil reservoir because you only get one shot to produce it. And so we had big finite difference models to predict the behavior of these oil reservoirs. And a really crucial aspect of that modeling effort was what we called a history match, where you put in the historical information that you were aware of, and you looked and calibrated the many parameters in a model like this, because it's a big three-dimensional grid, so that the model predictions matched well what happened in history. And then you went forward from there to make forecasts. And we found that to be really important for characterizing the models that had so many parameters that you couldn't measure them all. So we kind of took a summary of the predictions of the model, and to the extent that those matched the actual data, we found that to be very helpful.
Yeah, that's definitely the kind of model evaluation that we are doing, and the model diagnostic techniques that are available today are just really amazing. New techniques really developed in the last 10 years that really have advanced the science in really understanding what is driving sensitivity results in a model, and able to look at interactions between parameters and variables in a very sophisticated way. So yeah, but again, I couldn't agree more that historical evaluation is key. And what's interesting is some of the work that's being done, and I'll just point to Patrick Reed at Cornell University, who's leading our uncertainty characterization work. He's not the first to say it, but he's really very much emphasizing that when we do these model evaluations, you can get the right answer for the wrong reasons. Right. And so it's really important to be, I always think about my mental image is punching the air out of a paper bag. You've got to just go into every nook and cranny and really understand what these potential interactions are and why you're getting the results that you're getting. So, so it's a very exciting part of our research is to bring this, because a lot of domain science, let me put it a different way. There's a wide variation in sophistication in the application of uncertainty characterization techniques that we have found in our team. And it's everything from doing basic one at a time sensitivity analysis studies, to full-blown Markov chain Monte Carlo modeling.